you know that Al Capone was arrested for tax fraud and not the violent crimes committed on his behalf? Have you ever wondered what happened to the dominance of organized crime families that ruled American cities for much of the mid-20th century? Capone's lengthy evasion of prosecution revealed major loopholes in the legal system's capacity to arrest leaders of crime organizations. Their involvement in crime was so well known that they even became something of American folk heroes in blockbuster films like The Godfather and Goodfellas. What changed between the 1920s gangster era and the 1980s downfall of Mafia dominance in American society? Well, you might just get hit with the RICO.
OVO, East End, wraps up, we might just get hit with the RICO. Everyone home for the summer, so let's not do nothing illegal.
Hey everyone, Adam and Max back with another episode of UnRap'd, the podcast where we unwrap the history and culture behind your favorite songs and lyrics. Today we'll be unwrapping the law that led to the downfall of some of the most famous organized crime figures in American history, often referred to as RICO.
OVO, East End, wraps up, we might just get hit with the RICO. Everyone home for the summer, so let's not do nothing illegal. I gon' make 50 million and I give some millions to my people. They gon' go Tony Montana and cop them some Shaq at the free throws.
Our song today is a personal favorite of Max and mine, RICO by Meek Mill featuring Drake from Dreams Worth More Than Money, released in 2015. Today we'll discuss what the Racketeering Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act is, when and why it was enacted, its impact on organized crime, and how its use has changed, perhaps for the worse, and why Drake and Meek Mill might be worried about it in the context of the 21st century.
Criminality is as American as apple pie. But the 1920s in particular saw a major uptick in organized crime for the first time in American history. With the constitutional ratification of Prohibition, which criminalized the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol, opportunities arose that hadn't presented themselves before. These new organized groups had the opportunity now to fulfill that demand for liquor in American cities, now that it couldn't be fulfilled by legal businesses. The 18th Amendment was a decades-long pursuit by religiously motivated temperance groups hoping to curb alcohol consumption and in turn what they saw as the root of criminality.
So how did that turn out?
Well, pretty terrible. Aside from the fact that alcohol consumption only briefly declined after the 18th Amendment was passed, it was also effectively repealed with the 21st Amendment. You can't appeal an amendment, so you have to amend it after just 13 years. And it created a new, much worse problem. Organized crime. With the onset of a recession in the early 1920s, drinking habits quickly rebounded. As the American economy recovered and brought on the roaring 20s, people found themselves with more expendable income to purchase that illegally produced alcohol.
So it was a double-edged sword, kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. When the country isn't doing well, guess what? People drink. When the country experiences periods of economic growth and people have extra money, guess what? People drink. So basically, this was a terrible idea to begin with. It essentially created a black market industry perfect for organized crime. So Al Capone, perhaps the most famous leader of the gangster era, recognizes a new opportunity for his Chicago crime family, the Chicago outfit: bootlegging.
So why Chicago?
Great question. Chicago in the 20s was the perfect environment for such an enterprise. The city had long been known for its institutional corruption and for turning a blind eye to a whole host of illicit activities, particularly prior to bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. So it already had sort of the infrastructure and the institutions that were well known in the city, where this newly prohibited alcohol can be purchased and distributed and consumed. And Capone oversaw the production, sale, and distribution of Prohibition-era alcohol in Chicago. And if you didn't buy from Capone, guess what? Your business might get bombed. And who would show up offering to lend you the money to fix it? Al Capone. And now, you're effectively a business partner, and if you didn't want to be a business partner, well, that meant an early exit, if you know what I mean.
And Capone knew about all of this and ordered these early exits.
Exactly. He's the leader of this crime family. So anything that happens to further the business enterprise of the Chicago outfit is ordered by Al Capone. He knows about it, he's involved in it. And so over time, the Chicago outfit establishes themselves by repeating this behavior over and over again and gaining control over illicit business in Chicago. And even as this became known, the legal apparatus was never able to get him on any of these substantive charges because of a bunch of reasons, especially witness intimidation and lack of an impartial jury. The people of Chicago were scared of Capone. But perhaps even more so, it was because he didn't actually commit these acts himself. He ordered them. Capone isn't setting bombs off at people's businesses. Capone isn't taking out his enemies. He's having people do it on his behalf. And because of that, and because of his evasion from being found liable or prosecuted for these things, at this point in the late 1920s, Al Capone is feeling invincible. And this leads to what is largely considered to be his most heinous crime to date. So the St. Valentine's Day Massacre led to the eventual, yet anticlimactic, fall of Capone. At his Florida compound, Capone organizes the murder of an opposing crime family leader named Bugs Moran, and they execute this plan on February 14th, 1929, that's why it's called the Valentine's Day Massacre, with 2 plainclothes men and 2 police officers entering Moran's warehouse. Luckily for Moran, he happened to be late that day, but his men, when they saw these police officers walk in, they thought that they were being raided. But these police officers are actually Capone's men. And so when Moran's men turned to the wall with their hands up, Capone's men opened fire, killing all 7. And so Moran, of course, pointed to Capone as responsible. But there was one major problem. Capone had an airtight alibi. This highlighted the shortfalls of the legal system to deal with men of his stature. Capone was in Florida with proof. How could he possibly be responsible?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty coincidental that he took a vacation during all of this, but everyone knew that this was Capone's doing, and that's clearly the point, right? Like, he needs to establish himself as the premier crime leader in Chicago, which was the point of the massacre, and the reason for who it targeted.
Exactly. And so if he was feeling invincible before this, he's certainly not feeling invincible based on what happens next. So the massacre publicized the violence of the Chicago crime families, and the public finally had enough. They were outraged by this, and that public outrage caught the attention of the Federal Department of Justice and the Department of the Treasury, which had developed a plan to take down Capone on about the most unsexy charge that you could possibly imagine in the mob era: tax evasion. So Capone is living this publicly lavish lifestyle, but he never filed tax returns. So the Department of Justice recognizes what they think is a foolproof, if not unsatisfying, way to take down Capone. And it was successful, if underwhelming, and Capone was eventually sentenced to 11 years in prison on tax fraud.
I mean, that's like clockwork. Death and taxes. If you owe the government money, they're going to find you.
Exactly. Bombings, murder, those things are permissible, but you definitely better file your tax return and pay your taxes. So the Capone upcoming and later undoing revealed these major issues in the legal system's ability to prosecute leaders of criminal enterprises. And organized crime was just getting started. So Capone gets his start in the 20s. Meanwhile, the so-called Five Families, or the Cosa Nostra of New York, continue to dominate that city and exert influence over other American cities as well. And even though their existence was well known, it wasn't publicly confirmed until a 1963 Senate-led hearing on behalf of Joe Valachi, who was what they call a made man or a Mafia insider. And this Senate hearing is publicly broadcasted, and he sort of outlines the inner workings of the mob. In particular, the family that he was part of, the Genovese. Let's take a listen to what Joe Valachi had to say in 1963.
When did you become a member of this organization?
1930.
In 1930. What is the name of it? It is
Cosa Nostra.
So Capone was convicted and incarcerated in the early 1930s, but as Valachi testified, organized crime bosses continued to skate by prosecutions for violent crimes by having plausible deniability for decades. After the rise of the Five Families through the 1960s, the federal government decided they needed to pursue organized crime more vigorously, which led to the passing of the Racketeering Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Passed by Congress in 1970 under Richard Nixon, RICO specifically targeted white-collar and organized crime. In particular, it sought to give the federal government flexibility in prosecuting the leaders of crime families, the ones who reap the most benefits but rarely, if ever, do any of the dirty work. In essence, RICO makes being a knowing member of a crime organization illegal. Even if a leader, per se, only sees the income earned through racketeering, this means that even if the racketeering was committed by underlings, crime bosses would be held liable.
And how does RICO do that? Like, what about the legislation allows leaders to be held liable, even if they weren't responsible for committing these acts?
Sure. So by the legal definition, you can be guilty under RICO, and it might get a little dry here, so hold on. If you're associated with any conduct of an enterprise which establishes a pattern of racketeering activity. So there are 4 components here: the conduct, the enterprise, the pattern, and the racketeering activity. And more specifically, this racketeering activity usually has to have an impact on interstate commerce.
Okay, Mr. Lawyer, so what does that mean in terms that a layperson can understand?
Yeah, so that's good because I know we both had some trouble deciphering this legal jargon when researching it. But basically, in layperson's terms, an enterprise is any individual or a partnership or a group of people working together. And a pattern of racketeering activity just means 2 acts of racketeering committed within 10 years of each other. Now, this isn't normally what they would do. Most prosecutors wouldn't just put together cases of 2 acts committed within 10 years apart. They want to try to get better cases than that. But luckily, RICO is very broad, very comprehensive, and they list all of the crimes that count as racketeering. Included are the crimes that we would normally expect when we think of the mafia. So gambling, murder, kidnapping, assault, extortion, robbery, bribing, drug dealing, all of those things that you think of when you think of like your classic mobsters. But as we previously discussed as well, Congress also included other sorts of like white collar crimes like counterfeiting, embezzlement, fraud, money laundering, even copyright infringement. So extremely broad. And Congress actually made a point to say this, that the language of the act should be interpreted as broadly and as generally as possible to give them the sharpest sword, if you will, to prosecute these crime families.
Okay, so it's really broad and it sort of encompasses a lot of things and it allows leaders to be held liable for crimes that they didn't necessarily commit. But like, what makes this different than just charging somebody with, say, kidnapping or robbery? How does this make it any different?
Yeah, so a lot of the crimes that are considered racketeering acts under RICO aren't federal crimes. They're just state crimes. So first and foremost, the RICO sentences for these crimes were higher than the sentences would be for committing any of these apart from a criminal enterprise. And it also allowed for the government to make criminal organizations forfeit property that they thought might have been gained via racketeering. So stricter and harsher penalties for imprisonment and the loss of assets for these crime families. So this not only allowed them to hit the families harder, but it also gave them more leverage in trying to get testimony and in holding leaders accountable for longer periods of time. So, usually the acts have to show a pattern or some sort of implied continuous activity, but with the mafia, it was already apparent that they were operating systematically. It's called organized crime for a reason. So they were having this very broad, very hard for them to get out of it, and the sentence is very strict in order to put the leaders and the bosses of these crime families away for longer and seize more assets in order to prevent the families from recovering or to have a chilling effect on new crime families being formed in other cities within the United States.
Okay, it sounds like Congress was pretty thoughtful, I suppose, in putting together this legislation and thinking about the breadth of it and how it might impact ongoing organized crime in the United States. But how well does it actually work? Do they actually start to take down families with RICO, or how does it actually manifest itself?
So it took almost a decade for the first RICO cases to be brought, and it was slow for a number of reasons. First and foremost, as we already said, Congress tried to sidestep this by saying you could interpret everything broadly, but they still needed evidence. And like we said, they needed to have evidence of continuous criminal activity. So they needed to actually get something that they could prove that these families were committing crimes for more than just a few weeks or months to build the strongest cases possible. They didn't. So
they have to establish that pattern, and what types of information do they rely on to establish that pattern?
Exactly. So they needed testimony and they needed hard-hitting facts that would convince a jury. Now, one of the huge problems here, and one of the reasons why it took almost a decade for the first cases to be brought, is because one of the biggest rules in organized crime is that you're never supposed to testify against another member of the family. No snitching at all. That's rule number one. So this meant that they needed to gather evidence for a long time before they finally had strong enough cases on the leaders of these crime families to to bring a case in front of a federal court. And in the meantime, it's not like the organized crime families were slowing down. The first RICO convictions that actually preceded the crime families started in 79, but during this time they were as active as ever. The National Conference on Organized Crime in 1975, so this is after RICO had been passed, after this sort of chilling effect was supposed to have taken place, they estimated that mob-related racketeering reached about $50 billion a year, with a B, in the United States.
Wow.
Yeah, so the government was eager to stop this, obviously, and this just goes to show how airtight their arguments needed to be. The government is seeing these numbers, but they needed to make sure that they could put these people away.
So it's 1975, 5 years after RICO has been passed. They still haven't gotten anybody. When do they finally get to take down what we might call an organized crime syndicate?
Yeah, so one of the first kind of big cases that they bring against a kind of a gang, as we would call it today, was actually not against any of the organized crime families or the Mafia, but against the Hells Angels, a biker gang. And they were trying to hold them accountable for numerous racketeering crimes and trying to kind of test the waters on RICO, if you will. But there was a lack of evidence because of a lack of testimony, like we had already talked about. And with all of the lead up to why RICO was passed, talking about the mafia in American cities, mainly focused towards Italians and Italian Americans, juries just didn't really see bikers as who RICO was trying to target, which I think is interesting in looking at what the common person might think of as a gang member. And the Hells Angels actually did not get convicted under RICO in that first case in 79. So prosecutors learned from that, and within the next few years would soon be successful against the Mafia, which RICO was initially meant to target.
That's interesting that you mentioned that the sort of public perception, you say that like, these are federal crimes and federal trials, but that still means there's a jury, right? Like these are decided by a jury of your peers, so to say, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously Congress had already set the tone as to who RICO was trying to target, not Hells Angels. And on top of that, when you would think of crimes that are racketeering, you think of the mob. You don't necessarily think of guys with like maybe long hair on motorcycles rocking some leather. You know, you think of a guy in a pinstripe suit with a Tommy gun like chomping a big cigar. So this is not who the public had in mind, nor was it necessarily who Congress had in mind when they passed this. Remember, this was the outcome of the Valachi hearings and Joe Valachi, right? Like it speaks for itself.
I think that's an important point that we make about sort of who Congress saw as the people to be tried under this new law, and then how society reflected that understanding of who was supposed to be tried under this law. And in just a little bit later in this episode, we're going to talk about how that continues to shift again.
Exactly. But before Congress and before the federal prosecutors were getting ahead of themselves, they needed to tackle the crime families, which was the whole purpose in the first place. So by 1985, federal prosecutors felt they had enough evidence and brought charges against the heads of the 5 major crime families in New York City. This led to something called the Mafia Commission Trial, where the majority of these bosses and their direct underbosses were found guilty under RICO and sentenced to hundreds of years in prison combined. I believe each of the major bosses got 100-year sentences, so never getting out of prison. The first cases of the actual crime families had been seen as somewhat of a success, and after this kind of landmark trial, RICO had basically accomplished what it was enacted to do and saw more use throughout the late 80s and early 90s to kind of clean up, if you will, the rest of the organized crime families throughout the U.S.
All right, so we're talking about, we went from Al Capone to, Lucky Luciano to the Gambinos, all these different crime families. What does this have to do with Meek Mill and Drake?
Yeah, so, and I would recommend people to maybe check out the Patreon or do a little independent research and look up all these nicknames. They're absolutely incredible. But as Mafia-related organized crime waned in the 90s after kind of the big hits of RICO, federal prosecutors were still eager to use RICO, and its focus shifted from large crime families to street gangs largely made up of racial minorities.
So they took down some of the most powerful enterprises in American crime, and they recognized the power of this tool and focused their attention on sort of an emerging group of people who society started to think of as organized crime too.
Exactly. So federal prosecutors aren't just going to stop prosecuting, they're going to find a new group. And This group may be seen as a scapegoat, if you will, because they are a far cry from the large, systematic, operative acts of the American crime families and mafia as we had seen in the past.
As federal prosecutors set their sights on a new group to target after largely dismantling the American mafia under RICO, political rhetoric also shifted to support their efforts.
But we also have to have an organized effort against gangs, just as in a previous generation we had an organized effort against the mob. We need to take these people on. They are often connected to big drug cartels. They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel. And the president has asked the FBI to launch a very concerted effort against gangs everywhere.
This is a very well-known and rightfully despised clip of Hillary Clinton talking about majority-minority neighborhoods and groups in 1996. And this championing of a relentlessly tough-on-crime approach in predominantly black neighborhoods is echoed in Meek Mill's verse on RICO.
Me Millie, 'cause we in the field with them bird like we play for the Eagles. I'm on probation, so let me not talk what's illegal. Switch it up.
Although seemingly a far cry from the criminal enterprise of the Mafia from the 20s through the 90s, Meek Mill is talking about his own criminal enterprise here. For the uninitiated, Meek Mill uses birds to reference drugs here, specifically cocaine, while also tying it into his hometown of Philadelphia. He mentions how his counterparts are allegedly trafficking, as well as expands on these drug-related lyrics further on in his verse.
I come through my blood like I'm RICO. Poppin' no willy, no squilly, can talk to the cop, that's illegal. I was like more rich border, no double crossing on my peoples. I take an M to the table and split it with my niggas equal. I'm back on that hood shit.
This is where Meek alludes to his worry about being prosecuted under RICO. He draws parallels from the mafia codes of not switching and doing good by his friends, and in particular, he references supplying his friends with the M, or millions, that he's made as a rapper for them to continue their dealings. So that is where he's alluding to his potential involvement in prosecution under RICO, is that he's supplying his friends with the money to be able to engage in these activities.
But this is also where the application of RICO really starts to diverge from its original intent. Like in the Valachi hearings, Joe Valachi testified that each of his crime families may have up to 450 members. But in looking at recent DOJ and DEA filings, more recent RICO cases have been brought against street gangs in cities like Peoria and Syracuse with as little as 13 members. And sentences for some of these folks were no lesser than those of the members of the Mafia families. Of the 13 members of the Peoria street gang known as the Bomb Squad, the lowest amount of time for prison was 12 and a half years, with sentences getting up to life in prison and many for over multiple decades. Meek continues to discuss this, and he discusses his perhaps warranted paranoia about being prosecuted under RICO and being under investigated by the feds later on in his verse.
We came up from nothing, we started on lists most wanted, but now it's the Forbes list. We really was doing shit, I can hear echoes from feds on this beat from informants. I think they recorded. Shh, listen, you hear that?
In this verse, Meek references tactics used by federal investigators and lawyers to gather the necessary evidence needed to prosecute people under RICO. We mentioned that earlier in the RICO cases, they had a hard time compiling that evidence. So as society modernizes, as new technologies emerge, you start to have new ways of collecting that evidence. For example, people using recording devices, either wearing them or tapping of cell phones, etc. So Meek is a little bit paranoid and concerned about that. And Meek's concern with this isn't unprecedented. They say history repeats itself. Well, historians don't really say that, but colloquially, we say that. And modern prohibition of drugs essentially created the same conditions for organized crime to reemerge that we talked about in the 1920s with the prohibition of alcohol, but this time with much greater resilience. The war on drugs, like the failed attempt at prohibiting the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol, has similarly done little to address the underlying issue. Instead, it, maybe unintentionally, created a black market rife with criminal enterprise and profiteering. But those criminal enterprises haven't been prosecuted equally under RICO. We rarely hear about large drug rings being taken down and prosecuted, and drugs are pretty easy to find in most cities. And so that's exactly what Drake and Meek are concerned about here. They both allude to this idea that because they're rich and then help their friends out, and those friends might go on to use that money for illicit means, then Drake and Meek can be found criminally liable under a statute like RICO.
So that may be true, but what about the public opinion of what constitutes a gang or a criminal enterprise? When federal prosecutors tried to convict the Hells Angels for criminal enterprise in '79, the public didn't think of the Hells Angels as the right demographic, if you will, as to what RICO was intentionally made for. What about minority street gangs?
Yeah, so that we're seeing the same type of thing unfold with public perception of what constitutes a gang. So there was a study done that found that 86% of contemporary RICO cases involved gangs affiliated with at least one minority racial group. And critics of this study will often point to the fact in air quotes, that gangs are largely composed of racial minorities. But this is really an oversimplification, and it downplays the role that society plays in demarcating certain racial groups as engaged in gang activity, even if the actions of that group are identical to another non-minority group. Another study that was conducted in 1998 actually sort of undermines that argument anyway. So it surveyed 6,000 eighth graders, yes, eighth graders, in 11 cities across the United States. What it found was that 25% of respondents who considered themselves to have gang affiliation identified as white, which is a much higher number than the public seems to think. An additional 15% in that study, so those collectively would amount to 40%, would most likely be considered white by society if people saw them, but because they self-identified with a different ethnicity, Italian, German, Portuguese, they weren't counted in the white portion of this survey. And most recently, a February 3rd article published by Reuters claimed that the DOJ was considering using RICO to charge people involved in the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. Even a spokesperson for the new chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Dick Durbin, publicly cited RICO as a possibility for insurrectionists. So we'll see if that ever comes to fruition.
I think that might undermine our argument a little bit, but I'm not betting on that. Regardless, we hope that you enjoyed learning a bit more about an obscure piece of legislation that has greatly impacted American society, from dismantling the American Mafia to over-criminalizing people of color. RICO continues to contribute to the bloated prison population, and we will talk about this, but that is for another episode.
If you'd like to see some interesting pictures from the Prohibition and gangster era, as well as see additional details about the Valachi hearings and the incredible nicknames that Adam mentioned earlier in mob culture, you can subscribe to our Patreon at www.patreon.com/unwrapped podcast. We'd really appreciate the support.
You can also follow us on Twitter at UnRap'd and on Instagram at UnRap'd Podcast. We'd love to hear an idea for future episodes.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 2.
Thanks, everybody.
We might just get hit with the RICO.